Guys, Boxing Gossip here. Welcome to the channel. Hope everyone's doing well. Please support us by hitting the thumbs up and pressing subscribe if you haven't done so already. As regular listeners will know, I have recently finished recording and have uploaded a 3-part mini-series that I've called the 2017 British Boxing Review. And across 3 parts we've looked at number 1, elite prospects in Britain, number 2, contenders in Britain who are likely to challenge for world titles in 2018, and number 3, the most recent upload which went up yesterday, the current top 10 pound for pound, in my humble opinion, currently active in Great Britain. Now, throughout the course of recording these videos, it actually got me thinking about what all British fights we can realistically anticipate in 2018. And I actually just started noting them down, and I've actually come up with 15 separate all British fights that I genuinely see as realistic in 2018. Now, when I say I think they're realistic, let me clarify that. I'm not saying I think they will happen. I'm not saying I'd put my money on them all happening. I'm saying all of them are realistic possibilities. They're all fights that could potentially make sense, and they're not fights that I think are unlikely to happen, let's put it that way. So I'm going to talk you through this list of the 15 fights. We're going to start with, I don't want to say some of the lesser fights because I've only included relevant fights in this list, but we're going to start with some of the ones that, you know, maybe will fall slightly under the radar, and then maybe towards the end of the list we'll get on some of the real huge mega fights that I see as possible for 2018. So as we go through this, leave your comments in the section below. You know, when I'm talking about a fight, realistically, do you think it's going to happen? Is it a fight you're looking forward to? Who do you think is going to win? Leave your comments in the section below. Let's get some discussion going, and you know, I'll be interested to see what people think of these fights, you know, that I've come up with as realistic possibilities. So let's start. Number 1, and this is not really in a particular order, but number 1, Scott Quigg versus Kid Galahad. At present, in that featherweight division, where it's at is with Frank Warren. You know, you got Selby, you got Frampton, you got Josh Warrington, all working with Frank Warren. And in a sense, these two guys have been left out in the cold, Kid Galahad and Scott Quigg. Now, Kid Galahad is a guy who could presumably work with Frank Warren. You know, I believe he's a free agent. But Frank Warren's big money fighters in that division right now are Warrington and Frampton. Now, based on Warrington's career to date, based on the fact that Frampton, to my eye, looked very vulnerable in his last fight, I'm unclear if they would risk those names against a guy like Kid Galahad. You know, at this point, Galahad isn't a huge name fighter. He's not a guy who's going to sell big out arenas. He's not a guy who's going to sell pay-per-views, etc. So if you're Frank Warren, do you risk Josh Warrington? Do you risk Carl Frampton against a guy like Kid Galahad when he brings little to the table in terms of the commercials and does represent a real risk? You know, I think that's you know, a legit question. Now, the other named fighter in that division is Scott Quigg, who's also been left out in the cold because he's still with Sky. And if anything, his profile seems to have dipped, you know, since the likes of Frampton and Warrington have joined Frank Warren, and since he started training internationally in the Wild Card Gym. So I wonder if the sensible option is to make a fight between Quigg and Kid Galahad. You know, Eddie Hearn's working with Quigg. Quigg can't be the easiest guy to match up. You know, I know Quigg's potentially just won some sort of eliminator for a world title, but the world title scene at featherweight is very, very tough. You know, there's a lot of guys you'd pick to beat Scott Quigg there, the likes of Lee Selby, Oscar Valdez, Gary Russell Jr. So you wonder if Eddie Hearn is going to be looking at Kid Galahad and thinking that's a relevant fight, that's a fight that would intrigue certain boxing fans, and that's a fight that could realistically be made. They're both guys who are available. They're both guys looking for a big name fight. You know, and they're probably not guys with a huge stream of other big offers on the table. So one fight that I think is realistic, Scott Quigg versus Kid Galahad. Let me know your thoughts. Number 2, and I realise I'm going to have to up the pace because I've got 15 fights here. So if I don't up the pace, we're going to be talking about them, you know, for an hour. Frank Buglioni versus Anthony Yarde. And I'll caveat that by saying, as a second point, we'll keep it as one fight, Frank Buglioni versus Hosea Burton in the rematch. Buglioni is a guy who, for my money, is struggling for relevancy. He didn't come out of the whole Yarde, Burton, Callum Johnson, Buglioni saga overly well. It's kind of unclear where he's at in his career now. By his own admission, he rejected fights against Andre Ward. He rejected fights against Sergei Kovalev. Yet, he didn't seem overly eager to get the rematch on with Hosea Burton. Obviously his fight with Callum Johnson hasn't happened, and there's the Anthony Yarde situation. So, Frank Buglioni's got to make a decision. He's either got to, fight the Burtons and Yardes of this world, or he's got to take on the elite fights that he's been rejecting and go in as a substantial underdog. I predict that the fight that's going to be there for him for the biggest money is the Anthony Yarde fight. And as I say, I'll put a second option there as the Hosea Burton rematch, because that was a great fight first time out. I think these are fights that are only going to build and marinate with the beef that has been surrounding these two guys, and the fact that Yarde's profile is ever increasing. Could easily be a fight that doesn't happen, don't get me wrong, but I think it's realistic for 2018. Number 3. Luke Campbell versus Anthony Trollope. Luke Campbell, for me, is the best British lightweight currently active in the division. He hasn't held a world championship, but for my money, at this stage of his career, his upside is a lot higher than the likes of other fighters in the Matchroom stable, such as Anthony Trollope. Trollope, for me, he put in inferior performances to Luke Campbell, and really we saw that he was a level below Jorge Linares, whereas for me, Campbell impressed against Linares and, ran Jorge very close. I think Eddie Hearn will have seen that. I think he'll see Luke Campbell as a guy who can get another push. I think he'll see Anthony Trollope as a guy who's potentially in the autumn of his career. And I think Hearn may well look to match the two up against each other. It's a big payday for both, and get some more momentum and a big comeback win for Luke Campbell. So I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if that's a matchup that could be made, Campbell versus Trollope. And should it be made, as an aside, I'd pick Luke Campbell to win with a little bit in hand. Ricky Burns versus Josh Taylor. Ricky Burns, I kind of echo the comments that I've just made about Anthony Trollope. Appreciate Ricky Burns and Trollope fought last time out, and Trollope emerged victorious. Having said that, whilst Burns was the loser, he still obviously is a huge name and has a huge profile in Scotland. And the hottest thing in Scotland right now is Josh Taylor. Josh Taylor versus Ricky Burns would be a huge fight up there. It would sell out an arena up there. It would be a big payday for Ricky Burns. And if Hearn is convinced that Ricky Burns is at the end of his career, maybe even Ricky Burns is convinced that he's at the end of his career, perhaps Ricky Burns will be inclined to take that one final payday to try and get some big money out of Josh Taylor and to make an all-Scottish super fight. Kind of makes sense. Maybe with Ricky Burns only having a few fights less and Josh Taylor's profile exploding. Don't rule out that fight whatsoever for 2018. Lawrence Coley versus Isaac Chamberlain. This is a fight that's been talked about for a while. Eddie Hearn's indicated on Twitter that he's looking to make the fight, and I believe that fight will probably be made Q1 of 2018. An exciting fight between two exciting and highly touted prospects. Coley in particular, very highly touted with his knockout ratio, with his Olympic pedigree, would be a real interesting fight. It would be like a lesser version of Dillion White versus Anthony Joshua when they fought. Two guys, lots of potential. One of them the glamorous Olympian, one of them the slightly under the radar trade fighter who's well respected in the game, matching up against each other at an early stage of their careers to see which one will go on and have the higher upside. Don't be surprised if we see Lawrence Coley versus Isaac Chamberlain. Daniel Dubois versus Nathan Gorman. Similar comments actually to the comments I've just made about Isaac Chamberlain and Lawrence Coley. Two guys at an interesting level of their career. Not a crazily dissimilar fight if it were to happen in 6-9 months' time to when Anthony Joshua fought Dillion White. Nathan Gorman, the kind of trade fighter, well known amongst the boxing hardcore, etc. Daniel Dubois, coming in off a devastating run of knockouts, looks like the truth, but hasn't yet faced the level of competition he would be facing if he were to square off against Nathan Gorman. For me, for the Boxing Hardcore, this would represent a huge fight. It would be a real test for both guys with the upside to, really make waves in their professional careers. Frank has got a bit of a history of squaring guys off like this at this stage of their careers. I appreciate the examples I'm about to give are slightly further on in their careers than Dubois and Gorman, but let's not forget Frank made Cleverly versus Bellew when they were both unbeaten. He made DeGales versus Groves when they were both unbeaten. Frank isn't scared whatsoever to make these kind of matchups. He's got a track record of doing so. And, I think this could be a real interesting fight if built correctly over the next year. Right, so that's 6 fights that we've done, guys. I've got 9 fights left. And I think, realistically, these are probably the bigger 9 fights. All of these 9 fights are going to be fights that generate substantial interest. So let's talk about them. These are the fights that will hopefully look to cross over to the mainstream. Now, the first one is Selby Warrington, which I would say is probably the smallest of the 9 fights that we've still got to talk about. Lee Selby versus Josh Warrington. Warrington's put himself in a position by fighting for eliminators to get a crack at Lee Selby's world title. Lee Selby's obviously shown his willingness to work with Frank and work with that stable. This fight, after a long time of looking like it may get made on the Matchroom side, now could well happen on the Queensberry side with Frank Warren, Box Nation and BT Sports. It's an interesting fight. Josh Warrington's a huge draw in Leeds, big ticket seller there. Lee Selby, one of the top boxers in terms of pure boxing technique and ability, currently active in Great Britain. I see the 2 guys squaring off. I've always said it's going to be relatively easy work with Lee Selby, but it'll be a big fight and an entertaining fight as and when it does take place. Lee Selby versus Josh Warrington. The winner of that fight, so this is a separate fight now I'm talking, so I think I've done 7, so let's call this, this must be fight 8. I lost track of where I am in the video. But the winner of that fight, which I suspect will be Selby, but it could be Warrington, to face off against Carl Frampton. Frank, as you know, obviously working with Carl Frampton. Frampton, big debut, hugely successful show for Frank Warren and Queensberry out in Belfast. I suspect Selby may well beat Warrington, and I suspect we could well see Selby versus Frampton for the world title in Belfast on a huge Frank Warren bill, and that would be a fight to absolutely savour. I know Carl Frampton would maybe slightly prefer the Leo Santa Cruz rematch, but will Leo Santa Cruz travel to Belfast? I don't know. I know he's got a fight booked up against Abner Mares. I'm sure he's going to have other options in the States. He's a big name over there. Is he going to want to come over here and give up that home advantage? I'm not so sure. Frampton is going to need to look for big fights, and obviously he's going to want to look at a world title fight. And a Lee Selby world title fight is a definite option, given that they work with the same stable. It could be an easier fight to make, and I, for one, would be completely enthralled if it was made. So Lee Selby versus Carl Frampton, a big fight and a realistic fight that, in my eyes, could be made in 2018. Another one, now I didn't really know whether to include this or not for obvious reasons, but another one I've got down as a realistic fight is Haye versus Bellew. I know people will roll their eyes at it and say Haye should retire, Haye's pulled out injured, but according to statements it does seem that the fight is due to be rescheduled, and whether you like the fight or not, it's clearly going to be one of the bigger fights in British boxing if it does go ahead. Now, for what it's worth, my opinion is this fight actually will happen. I think there's too much money in it for both guys for it not to happen. I think it's too much of a winnable fight for both guys not to happen. I believe both men will go into the fight thinking they've got a majority chance of winning. And I think the guy in front of them will represent one of the biggest paydays available to them in world boxing. Now Haye or Bellew could maybe fight a Wilder or a Joshua, but they'd go into those fights as substantial underdogs. Here they're going into the fights believing that they're actually favourites to win, and they're getting that huge payday. So I suspect it will happen. People are saying, what has David Haye got left to offer? I think that's kind of missing the point. David Haye, for me, has always been an individual motivated by money, and I don't see him sailing off until the sunset, until he's collected that money against Tony Bellew, win, lose or draw, because it would be a huge payday. The fight's already been agreed, looking at dates in March or May of 2018. Look, let's see if it happens. Clearly, David Haye has got injury after injury after injury. I'm going to put my neck out and say this one does happen in 2018. The next fights, and we're going to kind of cover 6 fights left to mention. We're going to kind of cover 3 over the course of a single point here. Firstly, Eubank versus Groves. It's anticipated that the fight will be announced for February. Recent rumours have suggested it will be in Manchester in February. George Groves versus Chris Eubank Jr. Yeah, really, really looking forward to this fight. So excited for this fight. 2 entertaining characters outside of the ring. 2 extremely entertaining characters inside of the ring. We've got to give huge praise to the World Boxing Super Series for making fights like this happen. These fights are very difficult to negotiate, but the platform that tournament has created and given these fighters means that it's going ahead, and these guys are already scheduled to fight. I actually believe it's the only fight on this list, maybe other than Haye and Bellew, depending on how you look at this one, that's already been confirmed and scheduled to fight. It's an absolute fight to savour. I can't wait for it. I think it's a 50-50 fight. I could see and make strong cases for either guy winning it. And yeah, let's hope nothing goes wrong with that fight. Let's hope no injuries, no cuts, no withdrawals, no health issues. We just need to see that fight happen. Going to be a fantastic, fantastic fight in British boxing. Now, I mentioned I was going to cover 3 fights in a single point. So secondly, off the back of that fight, the winner versus Callum Smith. Now, I know you guys at home are thinking, oh, Callum Smith isn't the biggest draw, but what you need to remember is that will be for the world final, total final of the World Boxing Super Series. And this Super Series tournament has created huge interest, huge publicity, and has really been a massive success. Now, I know Smith has a tough fight against Jürgen Bremer, and I know Bremer could easily beat Smith. That's not a result that I discount whatsoever. But Smith is an overwhelming favourite with the bookmakers, so we've got to consider at least a realistic possibility that we've got an all-British final. We know one of the combatants in the final will be British, because it's going to be between George Groves and Chris Eubank Jr. There's a very realistic chance, according to the bookmakers, a strong majority chance, that Callum Smith will face the winner. So even if you're not sitting at home thinking, oh, I'm really excited to see Callum Smith Eubank, or I'm really excited to see Callum Smith versus George Groves, my prediction is by the time that fight comes around, if it does come around, that will be a huge fight, because the World Boxing Super Series will keep raising all the contestants' profiles, and whoever it is out of Groves and Eubank, their profile will be sky high after that fight. So I think Callum Smith versus the winner is a tremendous matchup. At the same time, I don't think the loser of Eubank Groves is in a bad place whatsoever, because I think whoever it is, they've got a huge money matchup with James DeGales. James DeGales is going to be a free agent after his next fight with Frank Warren. We'll have to see what he decides to do, whether he goes back to Eddie Hearn, whether he works with Frank Warren, whether he works with someone else. But DeGales needs a big fight. DeGales is hungry to be back into that mix, to get the recognition that he probably feels he hasn't had from the UK fans in his career to date. Even if Groves or Eubank takes a bad loss in their fight, their profile will be at an all-time high. They're huge names with the British public, and whoever it is, that is a fantastic matchup against DeGales. Obviously the loser of that fight, the loser of Eubank Groves, may go into that fight as an underdog against DeGales, dependent on how DeGales looks in December and dependent the nature of their loss. But Eubank is clearly one of the biggest names in British boxing. Groves is a huge profile after 2 fights with Carl Frost. Obviously, Groves and DeGales have so much history. The 2 together are a fantastic pairing, and I do think that DeGales versus the loser will represent a huge payday for both men, and I suspect that could well be a fight that will happen. DeGales will need a big fight, and some of the options are going to be all tied up in that Super Series final, so I think the loser of that is a realistic fight for James DeGales. Brook versus Amir Khan, another fight which upsets boxing fans, because we've just been round the circle so many times. Frankly, if this fight is ever going to happen, I think it's going to have to happen in 2018. Khan is on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. Maybe we'll talk more about that some other time on the channel. I don't know if I've got the energy. But Khan's profile is probably going to be very, very high off the back of that. And you know, if Khan wants to make more money from boxing before he sails off into the sunset, he's got to do it in the next few years. You know, neither of these guys are old guys, but they've both got a lot of miles on the clock. They both had very hard losses. They both had very, very tough stoppages. You know, they're probably both physically older than the age on their BoxRec profile would indicate. The opportunity to make dramatic amounts of money from each other will start to dissipate if this fight isn't made in the near future. And you know, I think that potentially this fight could be made. Kell Brook, does he really want to try and work his way back to a world title fight? Does he really want to get in those 50-50 fights against awkward 154-pound opponents with low profiles and huge talent? Same with Amir Khan. You know, does he want to get involved in scraps that he'd be an underdog in with those type of guys, or does he want to fight Kell Brook? You know, settle the score, make 10 times the money, and then ride off into the sunset. Let's face it, I know we've always had this theory that Amir Khan doesn't want to lose to Kell Brook because of public perception. I don't think public perception of Amir Khan could possibly get any lower at the minute based on some of his antics in the jungle. So, you know, maybe he'll want to get that money and, you know, come to the autumn of his career. I'm using that phrase a lot in this video, autumn of their career. And I do think it's a telling thing. You know, a lot of these biggest names in British boxing right now are what I would describe as the autumn of their career. And when I use that phrase, I'm saying autumn, not winter. You know, these are guys who maybe have 2, 3, 4 fights left. They maybe have 1 or 2 elite fights left. They may be 29 to 32, 33, they may have had tough fights, they may have had 1 or 2 losses, maybe they've started to look a bit less, you know, a bit less refined, maybe they've started to look a bit less skilled, like they've started to lose something, you know. Frampton, David Haye, Bellew, Trollope, Burns, DeGales, Groves, Khan, Brook. You know, a lot of the biggest names in British boxing fall into that category. Even guys like Selby, you know, I think Selby's now 30. You know, a lot of those guys, probably you're looking at 2, 3, 4, 5 elite fights left, you know. So I'm hoping that the fact that these guys are maybe coming to that autumn period of career maybe means these fights are more likely to happen because they're going to want to make the money when they've still got the time to do so. 2 fights left for you guys, and you won't be surprised to hear both of them are in the heavyweight division. The first fight may actually surprise some of you guys. Anthony Joshua versus Dillion Whyte. You know, I did a video 2, 3, 4 weeks ago now where I speculated that Anthony Joshua versus David Haye was a very realistic possibility. Long-time viewers will know I'm sceptical that Joshua Wilder fights actually happen. So I don't think it's out of the question whatsoever that AJ will fight Dillion Whyte. Dillion Whyte has, firstly, he's a proven commodity against AJ, you know. It's a fight that Hearn and Joshua will be very confident of winning, and it's a fight that they will be very confident will do huge numbers at the box office because of the history, the beef, the hype between the two guys. Dillion Whyte's probably been a bit of a thorn in Hearn's side recently. Dillion Whyte's been very, very hard to match up. He's tried to get fights against Wilder, against Lucas Brown, against Dominic Breazeale, against Derek Chisora, against Tony Bellew. He's tried to get all these big fights unsuccessfully, and Whyte kind of comes across like a demanding character. You know, he's not happy that he's not getting the fights he wants. Well, maybe Eddie Hearn will look to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You know, if he needs to keep Dillion Whyte quiet, if he needs to get Dillion Whyte a big profile fight, and at the same time he needs to match Joshua up in a huge pay-per-view event, perhaps he'll look to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Perhaps he'll look to do it in the spring, perhaps he'll even look to do it in the summer outdoors, because, you know, now that David Haye option is looking less likely for Joshua, I don't know if Wilder or Parker fights are going to happen. I'm sceptical about both. So for me, the Dillion Whyte Joshua fight, I know it wouldn't please the boxing hardcore, but that would be a huge fight to the casual public. The casual market would love it. They'd love Dillion Whyte's antics. They'd love the history. They'd love the footage of the knockout from the first fight. You could promote the story that Dillion Whyte was the guy who hurt Joshua early on, and that Dillion Whyte came into that fight without the right prep and injured and overweight. You know, really could be promoted. Don't rule that fight out whatsoever. I see that as a realistic possibility. Final fight I'm going to mention, and it's another one that's going to be somewhat sceptical, I think. Tyson Fury versus Anthony Joshua. My belief is that Tyson Fury versus AJ is the biggest fight in world boxing. I believe that Fury AJ is a bigger fight than AJ Wilder, certainly bigger fight than AJ Parker. It's probably a bigger fight than AJ Haye, bigger fight than AJ White. I believe Fury versus Anthony Joshua, that combination of characters, that combination of styles, the history, the story, I believe it's the biggest fight in world boxing. I believe the British public would buy into that fight like no other fight. And look, Tyson Fury's coming back. He's obviously been putting up footage of him training. There's still a lot of hurdles for him to cross. He's got to lose the weight. He's got to have a comeback fight, 1 or 2 at least. He's got to get licensed. He's got to have this hearing situation dropped. But the feeling is, the sort of talk on the forums, the talk on the Twitter at present, is that the wheels are in motion for Fury to come back, and actually to come back this time. There's kind of the suggestion that he will get licensed. There's kind of the suggestion that this hearing thing finally will go away. And there's too much money in this fight for it not to happen. From Eddie Hearn's perspective, he may look at Deontay Wilder, he may look at Tyson Fury, and he may think, what is the lower risk, a lower risk fight to make to protect his investment, which is Anthony Joshua. Wilder's the bigger puncher. Wilder's the better athlete. Wilder's the more active fighter. You look at Tyson Fury, see all the problems he's had with his health. You see the weight he's spiraled up to. You see the fact that he isn't this crazy one-punch knockout artist who will, decapitate you if you make a single mistake in the ring. He may think Fury is a safer fight for Anthony Joshua than Deontay Wilder. And I certainly think in the UK, not only does that sell out Wembley probably 2-3 times in actual fact, I think that could be the biggest pay-per-view fight of all time in the UK. I know people talk about the fact that Wilder brings that US pay-per-view market, and maybe that's true, but it's an unproven commodity. Wilder has no track record of selling pay-per-views. Wilder has no track record of selling out huge stadiums, as I understand it, in the US. That Tyson Fury fight may just be a little bit more appealing to Eddie Hearn. So, if Joshua was to fight 2 or 3 times next year, I'm not ruling out Dillion White and Tyson Fury being 2 of the opponents that he goes up against. I think those are going to tick boxes in terms of the commercials, and I think those are going to tick boxes in terms of the risk profile, especially when you consider how hard the Wilder and Parker fights may be to make with the splits, the egos, etc. Guys, that's my opinion. 15 fights between all British opposition that I believe can happen in 2018. Let me know your thoughts on this list. Which fights do you think are most likely to happen? Which fights do you think are most unlikely to happen? Which fights would you most like to happen? Which fights would you be less interested in? Who wins the fights? Leave your comments in the section below. Have I missed some out? Very possible. If so, comment those in addition. As I said at the start of the video, please do take the time to subscribe if you haven't done so before. Please hit the thumbs up button to get this video a little bit more visibility. Do give us a follow on Twitter at Boxing Gossip, and you can also add me as a friend on Facebook using the link in the section below. Many thanks as always. Appreciate you people taking the time to tune in to what I'm doing here.